I asked the chairperson, Dr. Yao Graham mentioned, the symbolism of this event really is what is humbling for me that I'm performing this. But I think that knowledge production is a critical tool in social change, because it's the knowledge that frames the discourse that legitimizes a system that gets people to accept or reject it. But it's also this knowledge that we use to guide our work and also shape the societies around us. So any publication in itself is a contribution to that knowledge. But we know that because of the political nature of knowledge production, it either strengthens the status quo or undermines it. And for people, I guess, looking at the number of people here who have made it here, I can say that there are people who in various locations, people here in various locations, are seeking to contest the existing framework, the existing systems, at different levels, with different concerns, and at different sources. So the symbolism of this document and what it represents is very important. Now, I must commend the efforts that has made this publication possible. The fact that some people remained alert and caught the classified documents and decided to capture it and render it in a form that is accessible to the reading public. And this continuous effort to ensure that it remains visible and not forgotten must be commended. It's a critical part of the struggle. My task as a reviewer, I assume, is to take us through the publication and highlight its structure, content, from front matter to back matter, traveling through the contents. Well, I intend to do so, and looking at the main body, the chapters, pointing out areas for attention. But I also want to offer suggestions for improving the presentation and its reach and appeal to readers. Now, in doing this task, I raise issues that I think it should attract our attention as people who are seeking social change, people who share a common concern for humanity, no matter their location and positions and levels of protection, to have available to them all that it requires for a decent living without worry. We know that sadly this is not the case in the world we live in. And we know that this world, in addition to the high levels of militarization, we live in a world where all forms of national disagreements are solved by military might. Fortunately, this deception of exclusive right to military might is being blown, and that's important. We live in a situation where there's a threat to the basic existence, the physical existence of humanity, and we are operating at business as usual. We are told that we are reaching the tipping point where nothing can reverse the global warming to flood our world, increase diseases. We've just been through a pandemic, and we are being assured that there are yet more pandemics to come. The intensification of neoliberalism, the extreme commodification of every aspect of our life, social, as anything you can think of. The debt crisis, rising poverty, youth unemployment, the absence of leadership everywhere, but even more intense on our continent. Let me also raise the right-wing revival, because alternatives really to the left have not been forthcoming. we face the specter of right-wing revival, which is undermining the existing rights we have. And for us in feminist struggles, the backlash around sexuality, the whole issue of homophobia, which in Ghana we have captured as family values, and we are spending more of our time in looking at criminalizing people's sexual orientation and sexual preferences, and not looking at the things that are threatening our very existence. These are the signs, and clearly the current political economic system, you are right, Chair, has run out of solutions. It has no solutions. It's actually creating the problems. It is in this background that I undertook the exercise of the review. It was not an academic exercise. I'm sorry. A political endeavor. I'm aware of this need to devise alternatives that respond to human needs. A political economic system that situates human needs and does away with the insatiable greed of capitalism for profit. The book, we are told, that will be launched later, is a reproduction of documents that span 1964 to 68, made up of reports, diplomatic conversations, in foreign relations, intelligence memos, telegrams, letters from Nkrumah, letters from Johnson. They were prepared as briefings or recommendations for endorsements, meetings held to discuss coup plots, how to undermine Nkrumah, how to gain and maintain a foothold in Africa. There are sections also that are excerpts from books, one by Mahoney on CIA's role in Ghana's first school, naming the local collaborators, Paul Lee's write-up also that put together the declassified documents, and a contribution also by Prof. Nkrumah. So really, it is a book whose main text is derived from secondary sources, but put together for a purpose. Yeah. Now, the background to the publication really is established in the front matter in the preface, which notes the context of African countries at the time it was of the launch of the fourth edition, which was 40 years after the coup. It noted the civil wars, internal strifes, and in Africa, in Libya, in Zimbabwe, Cote d'Ivoire, Syria, Iran, and all that. Yeah. Now, I must say that this book is situated in the 60s also. The 60s that were critical years in Africa as colonial rule was ending, and the expectations that there will be something new, something different, that the resources within our continent will be deployed to the benefit of its people. We note that there were different attitudes from the colonial governments, the British, to the French, to the Belgians, and the most extreme being the Portuguese. We know that all former colonies of the Portuguese had to resort to protracted civil strife before they could gain their independence. It was within this environment that Nkrumah emerged as a leader to Ghana, the first to gain its independence, and was very clear about the connection between Ghana's independence and the rest of Africa. I think that, let me just go back a little bit to the title of the publication and what it represents. As I read through, I asked myself, where is the deception here? And I'll explain. Okay. But I think that the deception really is derived from the notion that the US presented itself as someone that was friendly to Nkrumah, wanted to assist him, but then actively undermined him. Embedded in this notion is an issue of morality. But as Marxists, we know that really this capitalist system, this imperialist system, is not about morality. It's not about morality at all. But that is not to say that there's nothing to take out of the title of the Great Deception. Because I will want to raise a few deceptions as well. So let us be very clear. All who are seeking political positions, I mean frontline political positions, that the system is not about doing good or doing wrong. It is a system that works in a certain way, that requires understanding, and that requires strategizing. And your ability to strategize is important to remain ahead of your opponents as well. So the book has 4 chapters. After its front matter, the preface, the summary of Nkrumah's vision and introduction. The first chapter is titled Never Again, 40 Years After the Coup and the Derailed Africa Progress. The second chapter, Conspiracy Begins, the US and the assassination attempts on Nkrumah. The third, the plan that has been executed and how Ghana becomes a client state. And it covers discussions on US support to the coup plotters. And the last really is a collection of documents that present US plan to control African nations. And it's filled with discussions about what the African situation is, what the challenges are, and what should be done. For me, in this review, I just want to raise a few things about the relevance of this publication to our context, and the fact that, first of all, what it is that Nkrumah represents for Ghana, for Africa, and the world's working people. We celebrate him as African, but then also he really has something to say, not just for Africans on the continent and outside, but also for working people generally. The fact of the role and acceptance of his leadership in Ghana, of course, we have been told, has remained undisputed years after his overthrow. And his project still remains a bedrock of our national economy. Okay. The book, of course, lists a record of his achievements, just to emphasize this. And the industries, the dam, the social infrastructure, the fiscal infrastructure. You have to go to the book to look at it, if you haven't. Yeah. But what is also there is why Nkrumah was considered a threat. And these are lessons we need to keep in mind. The supposed anti-American incidents in Ghana, and the fact that really in all the discussions, the assassination attempts on his life are pushed to the background as if they are of no consequence at all, you know. The so-called expulsion of U.S. academics in Ghanaian universities, the daily rendering of U.S. as a scapegoat for the national economic challenges that we are facing, and even his failure to take action against anti-U.S. demonstrators, and his Marxist leanings, his clothes, and the fact that even whilst he's chastising the U.S., he has nice things to say about the communists. And the last straw was a publication of his book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. You need to read the book to see the reaction of Assistant Secretary Williams summoning the Ghanaian ambassador to the U.S. to protest about the book's hostility to its anti-American tone. I think the thing that I find really interesting is that America is worried about its image I don't think that he's worried about his image now. I mean, looking at what is going on in Palestine, and the fact that no Palestinian killed, no family member of a Palestinian that has been killed has been met by the US president. But then, the Russian dissident's wife has been met by the US president. And the US, I don't think that the US is interested in his image now, I hope. But then also one of the things that made Nkrumah, made Nkrumah appear a threat to the US also was the fact that he should not serve as an example to other African leaders. That was very, very important. In fact, what is interesting are the players in the memos, the reports, the discussions, and the meetings that tells you the level of threat that Nkrumah was considered. So presidents, CIA directors, high-ranking officials from the State Department, the Secretary of State, national security staffs, ambassadors, White House staff. And I mean, as I went through the documents, I said, really, if I could put together the number of hours that was spent, it tells us how critical Ghana was. And for those of you really very interested in rewriting history, Nkrumah was a force. Because if all these people invested their time and energy and intelligence, everything, to focus on him, holding meetings after meetings, it tells us how much of a force he was. There were other players also. Private investors, Kaiser, we will understand very soon. The US Peace Corps volunteers also. And then the African-American leadership. And the fact that there was a consistent engagement with the African-American leadership in the US to ensure that they do not develop into a strong lobby of the scale of Israel. That is really very important, you know. There were the European allies, the British Prime Minister, political heroes, for example, Edgar Player, who was being considered to be honored because he saved the American flag from being desecrated. This was during the demonstration against the US in Ghana. Of course, there's the international institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the Exim Bank, research institutions, NATO, International Court of Justice. They are all there pointed out as critical players. I mean, how many years now, and they are still critical players. Then there's the African states, the AOU, there's Olympia of Togo, and the Entente states of Francophone West Africa. But the local collaborators also that were identified. Because you see, the memos, the reports will talk about who you can work with and who you can use. Yeah. So the pro-Western military and police officers were identified very early. Ankara, Hali, Otu, Bedem, and then there's also Bedema. Civil servants, university academics, and there's mention of this forceful Irishman who was at the University of Ghana, opposed to Nkrumah. And then there's J.B. Dankwa, who actually allowed alterations in U.S. foreign and security policy. Others identified were farmers and market women. I don't know what really they did, but then the history tells us what they did. What were the weapons identified? So I raised these things And these have been taken out of all the chapters, but I raise them because I think in this review, I want us to take away lessons for strategizing, for mobilizing, for doing activist work. What were the weapons that were used? In fact, it is stated that these weapon strategies should be carefully selected gradual measures to set in motion chain reaction that will lead to Nkrumah's downfall. Carefully selected. They are not the exact words, I've changed them. But these strategies should be cautious not to undermine pro-Western elements and the image of the U.S. This image of the U.S. Right, okay. So, how did it play out? Personal and emotional pressure. Assassination attempts on Nkrumah, the bombs, creating a sense of insecurity to divert attention and to undermine his legitimacy. And there were times in the reports, it was almost as if they were gloating, you know. So references to Nkrumah crying, expectations of hysterical outbursts, depleting his emotional resources, Nkrumah as having gone round the bend, personal disintegration, and all that. Yeah. And pressure to be of good behavior. So there were frequent visits. U.S. state officials, and in fact, at a point, there was a suggestion that came from Nkrumah himself that there will be 2 weekly visits, meetings with the U.S. ambassador. Can you imagine? And anytime he went there, he was careful to point out to him areas where he had misbehaved, so that Nkrumah would ensure that he assured him that he wouldn't. Then there was psychological warfare to diminish Nkrumah's support in Ghana and Africa. I picked this thing about the boogeyman, you know, the boogeyman. And it's standard, isn't it? So Nkrumah as a problem, Nkrumah as a dictator, Nkrumah, you all know the things that are said about Nkrumah. And look around, everywhere there's a boogeyman. Castro in Cuba, Saddam in Iran, Gaddafi in Libya, Putin, the creation of the boogeyman, you know. But a counterpoint also to the boogeyman is a victim hero, person who work outside the law that the U.S. is using, but they are being also projected as credible voice of opposition and possibly credible leaders as well. And sometimes they get into the grips of the law, and there's so much noise is made about their civil rights, how they've been denied their civil rights, you know. I call them victim hero, and for us, that victim hero is J.B. Dankwa, you know. And when you are a friend to the U.S. and the U.S. does not feel threatened about you, you know what this means for your nation's interest as well. And I'm sure people from other countries, and even recent events around the globe, you can see some kinds of victim heroes that the U.S. would defend at all costs. Okay. The other is the economic, weakening the Ghanaian economy. And there's so many discussions around that. And the expectation that Ghana will be forced to the IMF kept coming up. So using instruments like aid, like debt, and foreign direct investments, the stabilization of our commodity price, sequencing and of payments of aid, and the size and all that, and insisting on counterpart funding as well. So for us, there were repeated reports about withdrawing support for the Akua Dam. Unfortunately, Kaiser made it very clear that really there had been so much investment and the returns were so good, he as a capitalist was not ready to let go. Then the level of finances that had gone on also, it was also very clear that if they stopped, then the communists will come in and they will lose their hold. But it kept coming up and it kept coming up. Aid was also a political weapon, and aid was withheld as well. Then there were the institutions of socialization. Really, one of the deceptions is the National Geographic magazine, which is being celebrated as one such source material that can get Ghanaians to get rid of their Marxist and communist ideas and get them to be friendly to the US as well. Then the Voice of America, the Cultural Affairs, Education, Scholarships, Telecommunication System, and Peace Corps volunteering as well. So it takes your mind as socialists to what Marxist analysis says, the whole, the superstructure and the soft superstructure, the institutions of socialization. But the AOU also was seen as a platform for controlling, because it would allow the US to present itself as supportive of struggles for independence, especially in Southern Africa and the Portuguese as well. Yeah. So, some of the lessons that emerged after the coup, and then I asked, were there issues of deception or issues of illusion? But I'll leave you to answer those questions as well. For the US, the coup, so when you go to the chapter that presents documents on the coup, the reports and the discussions, the US, some of the reports present assessments of what the coup means to Ghana, really. And there's this celebration as a windfall to Ghana, that and what the statement was saying, Nkrumah was doing more to undermine our interests than any other black African. And another this thing is in the new military regime. The new military regime, can you imagine? This military officers that put their lives to overthrow Nkrumah in the interest of the US. Do you know how they describe them? The new military regime is almost pathetically pro-Western. These are the terms. Read the book, you find them. And Nkrumah is saying, we are enjoying a honeymoon with him. Reference to Ankara and post-Nkrumah Ghana. They gloat about the intelligence gift. They didn't ask for it. But Ankara shipped Soviet military hardware and was important for the US because it facilitated the efforts in Vietnam. And then there are also comments like Ghana assumes a character more in keeping with its limited resources and prospects. Nkrumah did not. Nkrumah was taking us somewhere. Now we are assume a character which is more in keeping with our resources and prospects. You know? And just close to this statement, because then this one is on page 116, and on page 118 of the version I use, there's the one which is being launched is different. There's reference to how between 1950 and 1960, we have almost doubled our volume of cocoa exports, but our revenues for cocoa had declined. But that's not for discussion. Okay. So, and they were very clear that there will be no capable and dynamic national leadership that would emerge. And even if it emerged, even if one did, our economic malaise will persist for some time. They were very clear. They had done us what it was to do us. Yeah. And by 1967, there's a report that's lamenting that, well, I don't know, that the vacuum left by Nkrumah was still persistent. And talking about the lackluster performance of the military leaders. These are in the reports. Unfortunately, I don't think any one of them is still around, but maybe those who performed funeral services for their hero might want to look at some of these statements. So what did the coup makers achieve? There was a drop in the share of total aid to Ghana after the coup. The levels of investments, a few thousand tons of surplus wheat or rice. They said there, given now and then when the regime is quite uncertain to secure their future relations with the US. So what do? 25 tons of canned milk as part of 500 tons of milk. You know, so that aid that was withheld to Nkrumah was given after the coup. Yeah. Then food aid also was tied to economic reforms. Ghana had to go to the IMF, the World Bank. And then Ghana embarked on belt tightening, reduction in state expenditure. But the thing that got General Nkrumah was the failure of the US to stabilize the price of cocoa. That's all he wanted. And he actually mentioned that it was a stab in his back. Deception? Maybe. Okay. So really, it's not just Nkrumah, but even the coup plotters. And it took them no time to realize what it is they had done. They got nothing in return. But for me also, I talk about illusions. Because when I read, of course, I've read some of Nkrumah's works, but then his letter to President Johnson, very clear about Western interests and the US as a political and economic force that will stop at nothing to achieve its aim, you know. And I would like you to raise your spirits, to turn to that letter and read it. Just to raise your spirits before you start reading the rest as well, you know. So he was very clear about the meddling of the CIA, devoting all its attention to fomenting ill will, misunderstanding, and even clandestine subversive activities amongst our people. He also takes a jab at the US press. In fact, for me, this letter does not show any sign of mental instability that were being celebrated. But Nkrumah was also very clear that the US was sponsoring dissidents and the assassination attempts. What one doesn't understand was his desire to maintain friendship with the US and stay neutral, and keen to maintain good relations. I think these are lessons we might want to take, especially people who are seeking to take over Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana. The friendship, the US friendship. And I'm sure, even those of you in opposition, even those of you who are thinking of standing, that you have been receiving visits. And even when you have traveled, you have been invited to dinners. Now that we are in the process of discussing our debt and the restructuring, you should know that the pressures will come. The pressures will come, and it's going to be even more critical. We don't know where the war in Palestine will be. We don't know where it will be. But even if it's over, there'll be issues about what we do with Palestine. We don't know where the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia will be, but that will also be there. But as we have also been told, this imperialism and the way it feels threatened, so there's going to be a lot of pressure And that pressure will come in different forms. And this really is something that if Nkrumah, at this level of political, intellectual clarity, could not hold on and acquiesce to it, what do we do? But also the fact that he retained foreign private capital in the scheme for developing, for our development. In fact, the 7-year development plan, private capital, foreign capital had a role to play. And the price of cocoa also was critical in that. And therefore, this way in which he exposed himself, maybe, I think, it was an absence of a strong social change movement, a critical political base to support him. And I think this is important. The documents that are declassified and the lessons that I want us to take, all of us, even those of us that are in the communities doing social change work, is that there's especially the last chapter is filled with documents that is preparing the grounds for the US to maintain its hegemony. So analysis about the trends and the situations and which ones are likely to influence the stability of Africa and undermine Western interests. In fact, the US was very clear that Africa in itself did not pose a threat. What it didn't want was for Africa what it wanted to do was to prevent Africa from interfering and complicating important issues. Discussions about foreign relations and all that. But Africa in itself did not pose a threat. And it didn't even see that there was any historic relations between Africa and the US. And I asked myself, so what about the African American community in the US? But in those documents are clear strategies for understanding the situation and remaining ahead. So the plans have been done. And what are some of it? It was really upbeat that liberation movements on the continent have been contained. And that really Africa raw materials were no security threats. And so its efforts should rather go to Asia and Latin America, but just do something small so that Africans do not feel neglected. Okay. Arms supply were going to be limited. But the World Bank was supposed to play a critical role in managing aid flows, financing infrastructure projects, and then what is called the regional trinity. Then it was the AOU, the African Development Bank, and the UN Commission for Africa. Already their role in maintaining US hegemony had been laid and planned in the documents in 1968. So really you know that they've gone just better at doing that as well. In fact, current events tell us that. Did I mention aid? Aid was a critical thing. And the US was very clear that it did not have the resources, even if it wanted to fill in the gap. What it wanted to do was to send aid to places where it would be politically expedient. It's there in the document as well. Now, current events tells us that Nkrumah's overthrow was inevitable. Look at global occurrences, people's attempts at self-determination. We know that they've all been eventually derailed. Socialism collapsed in Eastern Europe. There was an investment, it did. Look at countries like Cuba. I mean, Latin America, the worst of it all was Chile, North Korea, Sudan, Angola, Mozambique, Libya. Iraq, Iran, Syria. It doesn't matter that. And now look at Russia and Ukraine. I mean, Russia certainly is not communist. Russia is capitalist. But Western capital, and look at China, Western capital doesn't even have space for other forms of capital as well. So it was only a matter of time, you know. I mean, but then for me, the deception that has to be highlighted is the fact that Nkrumah's work and what it is that he stood for has not been erased, could not be erased, and will not be erased. So, the deception is not just what the US did to us in Ghana and the rest of Africa, but the deception also is the assumptions under which it operates. And that deception also is about the inevitability of the neoliberal system and that there will be no alternative. We know how with the fall of the Berlin Wall, where people who celebrated that it was end of history because then there was going to be nothing after capitalism. But it is clear that that's also a deception. That's not the end of history. It is really the beginning of history for the oppressed people of the world, for the oppressed people of Africa, for the oppressed people of Ghana. Now, for us, our political leaders should note that the only way they can counter this is to invest power in their people to meet their needs. We know, I mean, I listen to discussions from political figures and all that. Everybody is talking about the IMF and the World Bank and what they can do. We haven't started that discussion yet. We need to start that discussion. There's nothing in there for us. If you go there thinking that there'll be something for us, that's an illusion. You deceive yourself. We need to invest in people. We need to begin speaking to our people, and that has to be the first step to develop alternatives. Let Ghanaians know, let Africans know, let the working people know that our leaders are there for them. They'll support you no matter what, because they know that you are working for them. So for me, the what next is this knowledge as a tool. Because just like you, Chair, I happen to have grandchildren. I've been looking at their textbooks and what it is that is written in them and what it is that is presented, you know. And I think that the readership, the targeted readership, should not be just adults like us, but should also be thinking about even younger readers. So, in terms of improving its reach, I would like the next edition to revise the timelines in ways that even younger readers can follow and make sense, and also ensure that it can serve as a source book for parents who are struggling to answer children's questions about, it's called OAPE, Our People, Our Wealth. Our World, Our Wealth. Our People. Okay. Of course, the edition I got had issues of editorial typesetting and layout. I believe all these things have been dealt with. But I also believe that a full rendering of abbreviations would help. I had to go back and do a search. Fortunately, the World Wide Web allows that, so I could search and read. But the rendering of abbreviations and footnotes also, explaining critical events will also help as well. I also want to advise that we give out these books to critical libraries in this country. And there's a list of them, the university libraries, school libraries. Take it to them and let them know. Because reading this, you know, is important for us to claim our humanity, our sense of dignity, that we have done something. We have dared to dream. We have dared to plan. That we are not that hopeless. We had a vision. Reading this also is important for people who imagine that they can betray their nations. When the pressures come, please remember, after you have served their interests, they just let you off. There's nothing in this for you. And you still have to live in your own country. I think that these are critical lessons that we need to go. So as we think and wait to get our copies and read, I would like us to remember that the battle has just begun. It is critical that we inform ourselves daily and at all times. And this book, Great Deception, plays a critical role in that information that we have to give ourselves. Thank you.